Without the direction of mind, mankind loses his advantage as a species and can hardly compete with a beast. Therefore, if someone were to tell you that you should do just that and relate to the world around you merely as an animal, as the best means for survival, and not think, what would you say? Obviously absurd, right? But if the world around us is the economy, and our relation with the economy is to do nothing, what would happen? Will everyone's individual manufacturing, constructing, buying, and selling, if allowed to be guided merely by unrestrained selfishness and greed, work itself out? Well, when it comes to the derivatives market, held to be in quadrillions of dollars, the refrain is, let it alone. In other words, do nothing. Don't think. Were the derivatives supposed to think for us? At a time when all the governments of the world are meeting together in an attempt to come up with a solution to fix it, why are their economists still huddling around together, paging furiously through textbooks for the answer? They beg, where is the formula, the mechanism that will give us the permission to continue not thinking? Like the glazed-eyed students who chant, what do we have to memorize to pass this test? They want to know what new model will make the economy work so they can resume doing nothing, acting as mere traffic directors or casino managers of the very same derivatives market. As Adam Smith wrote in his Wealth of Nations, when it comes to the economy, let it alone. Or in other words, do nothing. It's the only approach that is religiously acceptable. What religion is this? Usury. Truly, as will be made clear in this and the following episodes, until the assumptions underlying this religion are identified, and the government acts with a consciousness of their falseness, adopting the correct alternative, there is no hope to avoid the full weight and horror of the global derivatives claims, destroying civilization in a fate far worse than that of the 14th century collapse of the Venetian usurious banking system. Hence, now is the time for you to listen closely. In the 1750s, militarily, the world consisted of rival states, but no one dominant force. This changed in the year 1763 as the First World War, a 7 Years' War, involving the whole of Europe and stretching as far as India and the East Indies, came to a close. The British East India Company came out of the war claiming Canada, the Mississippi and Ohio, part of Florida, and India from the French, the East Indies from the Dutch, and rose victorious as the British Empire, the world's largest colonial empire with Europe in complete devastation. Lucky blokes? Or military genius? Neither. Just buggers. The role of the British East India Company was one of a Venetian hand, promoting others to kill themselves. Lord Shelburne, in conjunction with British Prime Minister Pitt, orchestrated the 7 Years' War, and by supporting Frederick the Great with enough money to keep everyone at each other's throats long enough to exhaust Europe, reaped the reward of being elsewhere. This achieved the intent of the European oligarchy to shift their operation of financial usury from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. This shift had been the policy of Sarpi since his role in bailing out a bankrupt and ruined Venetian banking system in the late 1500s, after they had taken their toll, getting hit by the effects of the cultural transformations created by such Renaissance movements as Louis XI's France, transformations which later erupted against Venice in the League of Cambrai. The 7 Years' War established Britain as the new Venetian-style world empire of finance. Britain did not win the war with the British Navy, but a private company, the British East India Company. After 1763, a new policy of anti-imperialism was promoted through the Isles by the likes of Adam Smith, Shelburne, and others, that it was far too costly to maintain the world colonial empire through military occupation. The case had to be made, however, how those colonies, being given full control of their land, would still yield their trade routes and produce for the consumption of the empire. The man plucked for this task was Adam Smith, who, departing to France in 1764, the year after the war, assembled physiocratic doctrine, which, in conjunction with his own, formed what would later be his Wealth of Nations, an apology for this newly formed British Empire, published in 1776 in time for a new method to control the rebel colonies. Shelburne's view was that with this new ideology of free trade, with Britain controlling the sea lanes, the colonies would be looted just as before. However, this takeover by the British Empire soon brought to a head the confrontation with the cultural strivings of America. In Smith's Wealth of Nations, we find the well-known free trade doctrines that when it comes to industry, let it alone. That it is improper to manufacture a good if someone can make it cheaper than you. And that if you promote your own selfish interests, there is an invisible hand that makes sure it leads to a good end, even if you didn't intend it. Refuted by patriots such as Alexander Hamilton in his 1791 Report of Manufactures, and which Matthew Carey in 1819 called a mere sophistry, calculated to embarrass and confound common understandings, a doctrine that would lead to the certain ruin of any nation who adopted it, and Smith as the Delphic oracle of political economy. With such clear, scientific, and ample refutations to choose from, by a history of our founders of our Constitution, and American patriots since our inception, why are these mindless, foolish sophistries worshipped still today, globally, by all nations? The secret to this lies not in the long-winded sophistry of Wealth of Nations, but in his earlier treatise, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, published in 1759, better named How to Win Slaves and Influence Them. Someone asks, do you have a fellow feeling with their passion or sentiment? Do you find that the cause or object of someone's passion has an appropriate relation to the way they express it? If so, you sympathize and call their sentiment right, and if not, wrong. Smith continues that the greatest thing we seek is the sympathy of others, and therefore we will adjust our expression of them as necessary to obtain it.
And so then the guy says, what am I, your mother?
We should laugh when others do, and not too loud if our friends only smile.
So I said, now that's what you call a down payment.
If our grief, indignation, admiration is too much for our friend, we won't get his approval. So we lower our passion to that pitch in which the spectators are capable of going along with us. And there is a little man within the breast who forms the correct response to get sympathy from others in reward. But where do we get the information from which to determine what the proper correlations are between someone's passion and the object of that passion, which would allow us to sympathize with them? And where does this little demigod within the breast get informed in order to tell us the appropriate expression of our own passions? There is a place from which we gauge the appropriateness of all sentiments, both others and our own. This is the impartial spectator, that is, popular opinion. If the little man living within our breast is on good terms with this impartial spectator, we will get ahead. All actions of man are thus determined by the imaginary, assumed existence of some point of cultural equilibrium, popular opinion, the impartial spectator, or for Adam Smith, a fine replacement for morality. In his judgment of others and of his self, mankind is therefore essentially a passive object, determined not by himself from within, but formed completely from without. There are no truths or discovered principles which aid man to reason out in his mind what may be right or wrong. It is merely the sensations that impress upon his organs over time and teach him. The self-evident value of sentiments informs him. The use of his reason is limited only to determine what the imaginary, non-existent place of popular opinion thinks, in order to inform him how to act, in order to obtain his selfish desire for approval.
These boys greet their dad as though they are genuinely glad to see him, as though they had really missed being away from him during the day and are anxious to talk to him. Tell Mother how good the food is. Maybe Sis rates a compliment too. It makes them want to continue pleasing you.
Smith's society is one of liars and fakers, adopting the sentiments and opinions of those around him, and the cultural norms of his time. And the sum of each person carrying out this holds the whole mess together. Society is thus reducible to the interactions of these sentiments, abstracted out of the context of the human ideas in which they were generated. In America, founded on this conception, unlike Smith's oligarchical society, government was founded to be an institution of mind, promoting the creativity of its citizens and directing the economy toward that end. But who could tell today? For how can the government promote that potential of man if the government decides to do nothing, let it alone? And by adapting to this conception of man, we have submitted to the British Empire's 1763 freedom of trade that was designed to destroy us. Without the direction of mind, mankind loses his advantage as a species and can hardly compete with nature. And whenever mankind replaces his mind with the non-thinking religion of the inherently irrational marketplace, what is the consequence? Therefore, when you think about the holy places of worship today, you have to ask yourself, what or who is being worshipped? In who are citizens putting their trust? In who are you putting your faith? By adopting this G20 resolution, your president has effectively sold you out to the British Empire's 1763 doctrine, giving up our sovereignty to the beginnings of an international currency and a continuation of a policy of throwing your future into an attempt to bail out a failed international speculative bubble, which has been based on looting the world. The derivatives never had any value. They were like a card game where the bets are based on the bets of a card game in the room downstairs. But the assumption which the G20 attendees agreed to is that they always did and still do have value. For Lord knows, we could never get rid of the derivatives market, for where would wealth come from? No, we must maintain the sacred rights of the private property of the hedge funds. Don't try to tell me Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution deems our derivatives trading unconstitutional. Without it, where would wealth come from? Somehow, if we just get enough liquidity flowing into the system, clean out the dirty pipes, and get a big enough regulator with a new IMF having the power to oversee international trade, the market will flow once again, and the derivatives will come alive, and wealth will be reborn. Does the supranational financial oligarchy believe in this invisible hand doctrine? Of course not. Like the man who wrote it, it is their tool to destroy the power of sovereign nations. Does anyone who is running policy from the highest levels of government actually believe it? Most of them are smart enough to know that the invisible hand of Adam Smith certainly does have an intended effect. But whether they believe it is not the question. They have agreed to go along with policies which are based on these assumptions. The relevant question is, just how foolish is the President of the United States, who would eliminate anyone who threatens his honor of getting in with the Wall Street Tories and joining them in kissing the feet of their god, Adam Smith? And beyond the President, to those around him, ask, just how dumb are those who have adopted these assumptions? To what really have these White House dupes agreed? And if they knew, would they still feel comfortable praising them in public? According to Adam Smith, since we are externally determined by the sense impressions from without as a Cartesian particle, by the impartial spectator's view, we do not and cannot use our reason to come up with the proper means for what society needs. If one thinks that their reason can contribute anything to the final causes of society, such as the general welfare, the common defense, they are irrationally claiming to be something more than their sympathies.
Although we are in this manner endowed with a very strong desire of those ends, it has not been entrusted to the slow and uncertain determinations of our reason to find out the proper means of bringing them about. Nature has directed us to the greater part of these by original and immediate instincts. Hunger, thirst, the passion which unites the two sexes, the love of pleasure, and the dread of pain, prompt us to apply those means for their own sakes, and without any consideration of their tendency to those beneficent ends which the great director of nature intended to produce by them.
Thus is revealed the secret behind his later wealth of nations. This irrational instinctual greed of man and desire for wealth is all preordained and divinely orchestrated, he writes, because it is this greed, this love for money, that leads to all progress. This is the great secret to economics, because this irrational nature of man toward greed leads to so much good.
It is this deception which rouses and keeps in continual motion the industry of mankind. It is this which first prompted them to cultivate the ground, to build houses, to found cities and commonwealths, and to invent and improve all the sciences and arts which ennoble and embellish human life.
You lowly creatures called man can't presume to know how economics works. It's a mysterious science that works out because of a mysterious force of the market. As Smith wrote in his later Wealth of Nations, just let it alone. Don't think. There you have it. The invisible hand which runs the wealth of nations, a doctrine for dupes who would sell their nation to the British Empire. All the while Smith laughing with Shelburne that this doctrine of means and ends might just be accepted by people stupid enough to believe it. He didn't think society and economy is based on selfishness and greed. He knew society was run by an oligarchy trying to maintain power, and merely the instrument to get them to adopt a doctrine that will destroy it. Thus did Smith write outside the existence of nations a doctrine for feudal Europe and for the perpetuation of a global empire of finance, a doctrine whose chains have been fastened more and more over the recent decades since the death of FDR, and if not broken now, guarantee for us a new dark age.